All right, so let's talk a little about what we talked about yesterday. We talked about objects. These things, denoted by curly braces. Now that's called an object literal. Literal as opposed to variable, basically. A string literal would be quote something quote. A number literal would be just a bare number. So when it's not assigned to a variable or anything, when you're just putting the value itself there, that is called a literal. That's true of basically every programming language. That's a generic term. So an object literal is the simplest way to create an object. And objects have properties. And you can add properties one of a couple different ways. You can do it inside the object literal when you first create the object, like we do with country here. Now in this case, the key is country, the value is USA, and country is a string despite the fact that we didn't put quotes around it. That's because since follows the naming rules of JavaScript variables, it doesn't have any dashes or spaces, it doesn't start with a number, we don't have to put the quotes there for the key. We would for the value, but not for the key. It's not going to think it's a variable or something. Animals, it's exactly the same. It is as though we had put animals colon and then that array up in the object literal. We just added this key after the fact. And that's fine, you can do that. If you try to refer to a key on an object and it isn't there, you're going to get back a special value called undefined. Now, if you tried to say things.animals.something else before you had set it to anything, then you would have a problem because you can't access other properties of undefined because undefined is nothing. But it's fine to just reference things.animals. Just know that the value will be undefined until you assign something to it, which we do here. And notice the value in this case isn't a string. All the ones we did yesterday were strings. But the value can be anything. This isn't creating two different keys, one set to dog, one set to rhino. This is a single key, animals, that is pointing to an array holding both of those strings. The value could be another object. It could be a DOM node. It could be a number. It could be anything. Not limited to strings. Though we do tend to keep the indices strings. Functions as properties. Properties aren't even limited to those things. Arrays and strings and numbers and stuff. They can even be functions. So we did that yesterday, didn't we? And we did it inside the literal, I think, as opposed to like this, but same thing. Now things has a method called explode, equal to that function. What do I mean by method? A method is simply a function that is a property of an object. How do we get to properties once we've defined them? Two ways. Using the dot refinement operator or the square bracket operator, just like an array, in which case you pass in a string. When can we use the dot? When the property name follows the naming rules for JavaScript variables. In other words, no spaces, it doesn't start with a number, that sort of thing. But we could have said things square bracket, quote, animals, quote. Same exact thing as that first line. Now in this case, we also could have said things dot kaboom, and it would be the same as the second line. Just two different ways to access the properties of an object. When else might we need to use the square brackets? Right, in an array. That's how you access the items in an array with the numerical indices. Out of an object, if you happen to have the name of the property stored in a variable, say we have a variable called in, and it has the index we want. We can't say things.in, it'll look for a property called in, right? But we could say things square bracket in, and then whatever the value of in is, say it's the string kaboom, then that'll work. So if you have the name of the property stored in a variable or something, you can still use the square brackets to get to it. We talked about functions yesterday and the crazy variable scopes they create and the value of that magical variable this. Several ways to create a function. One, a plain old function expression. Keyword function, space, name of function, parentheses, arguments optionally, curly brace, the body of the function. We also created functions as variable assignments. So const sum equals, and then the function expression. Or, instead of using the function keyword, using the fat arrow, an arrow function. And we know that the difference between these two has to do with the binding of this, which we'll talk about in a minute. As a general rule, the value of this depends on how the function is invoked, how it's called. Not so much where it's declared, unless you use an arrow function, but how it's invoked. Normal function invocation, name a function, parentheses. That's just calling a function the normal way. When that happens, what is the value of this? You don't need any additional context to know. You don't need to know where sum was declared or anything. It's window. If you don't know otherwise, it's just window, the global object, basically useless. What if we did exactly the same thing, but it were an arrow function? So we're still just invoking it the normal way with parentheses. It's not a method or anything. It's not on an object. Now the value of this is whatever this is in the surrounding function. So whatever the value of this happened to be on the line right before const, that's the value of this inside that sum function. So even if you invoke it the old-fashioned way, where ordinarily it would get bound to window, an arrow function binds this to whatever this was just outside of that function, which may still be window, but it may not be. So we took advantage of this in our map function yesterday. We passed map a function that did something to every item in an array, and we declared it with an arrow function. That way, inside of that, this was still bound to the outer object. Very convenient, and there was much rejoicing when this was added to ES6. How else can we invoke a function? Well, we can let it do it for us by firing an event. So in this case, the arrow function there, which is anonymous, we didn't give it a name, is added as an event listener. So we're never calling it. We're never putting the open close parens to run that function. It runs because an event fires. And when that is the case, this is bound to the same thing as event.target, the thing on which the event occurred. So if it's a button click, it's the button. Speaking of which, I'm missing an argument there to add event listener. There should be a first parameter that's something like click or submit or mouse move, some sort of event. Say that one more time. There's a special event object that's automatically passed into the callback that you put in here. So when you define an event listener and attach it, whether you put an argument in your parentheses or not, when it calls it, it's always going to pass in an event object. So if we want to do anything with that, we have to give it a name inside the parentheses there. So it's just an argument, and since we're not the ones calling it, JavaScript is calling it automatically, We know it's going to pass that in because that's how event listeners work. And that's how we have access to target. That's how we can do prevent default and all of that. Now there's another type of function invocation having to do with methods. So methods, again, are just functions that are properties of objects. And we did this one using the shorthand. This is exactly the same as if we had written explode colon function parentheses curly brace. But you don't have to write all that out if you're doing this inside an object literal. You can just say the name of the method, parens, curly brace. Now, if there were another, if we were putting another property on this thing object, following that, we would need a comma after this curly brace right here. So to invoke that method, thing.explode. So now what is the value of this inside explode on line 3 there? What do you think? For once, it's what you think it is. It's thing. So when a method gets called as a method, in other words, object dot name of method parentheses, this gets bound to the actual object. That way you can refer to the object itself from inside its own methods. Now, had we said explode colon parentheses arrow and made that an arrow function, then it might have gotten bound to something else. It depends. It would have gotten bound to whatever this was in the surrounding context. So that's one case where it could work against you. Questions about that stuff? We'll see many, many, many more examples of it. You'll be sick to death of it and hopefully comfortable with it.